You need to stop the third world coming to Britain. We cannot take any more of it, can we? We have simply...
In Beverly Hills, a 1 p.m. curfew went into effect today, all part of an effort to prevent some of the looting and violence.
Just after midnight, in the heart of one of Britain's busiest metropolitan regions, an internal situation report began circulating among senior officials. It was not meant for the public. It was not meant to leak, but the language alone told a disturbing story. The report described a system under visible strain, public order stretched thin, and confidence in authority quietly eroding. According to internal assessments, what was unfolding was no longer a series of isolated pressures, but a connected national breakdown that had been building for years and was now surfacing all at once. In the early morning hours, as streetlights flickered across shuttered high streets, emergency calls surged from multiple districts at the same time. Reports suggested crowds gathering without clear leadership, shops closing preemptively, transport hubs slowing to a crawl. Police units were redeployed repeatedly, not because of a single major incident, but because too many smaller ones were happening at once. Sources close to the situation claim that senior commanders quickly realised this was something they could not simply contain overnight. By sunrise, footage began circulating online. Families were seen being escorted out of shopping centres. Metal shutters slammed down as store owners chose caution over commerce. Sirens echoed through residential streets, where nothing like this had happened in years. Parents clutched children, unsure whether they were witnessing a one-off disturbance or the start of something far larger. Critics argue that what shocked the public most was not the chaos itself, but the visible hesitation of those meant to control it. Officials initially described the scenes as spontaneous disorder, but internal briefings painted a more complex picture. According to sources familiar with early reviews, analysts noticed a troubling pattern: similar incidents, similar timings, and similar points of pressure across different boroughs. This was not coincidence, this was coordination, and it forced authorities to confront a possibility they had long avoided: that the system designed to manage population flow, housing, and enforcement had been quietly exploited. Behind closed doors, teams began reviewing data tied to asylum processing, temporary accommodation contracts, and regional oversight gaps. What they found raised alarms. Shell organisations, operating under the banner of humanitarian assistance, appeared repeatedly in housing and relocation records. Logistics routes that were supposed to be monitored showed unusual consistency, moving people faster than the system officially allowed. According to internal assessments, legal loopholes had not simply been discovered, they had been relied upon. One senior official, a high-ranking figure within the administrative chain, became central to these discussions. Publicly, this official had spoken often about compassion and balance. Privately, documents suggested that warnings had been dismissed, audits delayed, and oversight softened. Critics argue this was not negligence, this was design. As one internal note reportedly stated, the system didn't break, it was bent. As the day progressed, emergency meetings were called, enforcement teams proposed targeted operations, border units requested temporary authority expansions. Deportation processes were flagged for acceleration, but each proposal collided with a resistance. Court challenges emerged almost immediately. Legal injunctions slowed action to a crawl. Political advisors urged caution, warning of backlash, protests, and reputational damage. According to sources close to these meetings, the word used most often was not solution, but risk. Outside government buildings, frustration was becoming visible. Shop owners spoke to cameras with shaking voices, describing repeated thefts, intimidation, and the feeling of being abandoned. Frontline officers, speaking anonymously, described exhaustion and confusion, rules that changed weekly, enforcement that felt selective, and a growing sense that order itself was negotiable. Parents questioned whether streets were still safe after dark. The public mood shifted from concern to resentment. Reports suggested that certain crimes were rising faster in areas already under strain. Knife incidents, organised theft, and exploitation scandals became part of everyday conversation. What angered many was not just the crimes, but the perception of unequal response. Critics argued that enforcement appeared firm in some cases and hesitant in others. The phrase two-tier reality began appearing in opinion pieces and online discussions, reflecting a belief that justice was no longer applied evenly. At the same time, silence spread. People spoke openly online but avoided saying the same things in public. According to polling data reviewed internally, concern was widespread, yet visible protests remained limited. Fear of being labelled, misunderstood, or investigated kept many quiet. Sources close to the situation described it as pressure without release, anger building beneath a calm surface. By evening, senior advisors warned that trust itself was becoming the casualty. When citizens stop believing that rules are fair, compliance fades. When compliance fades, authority weakens. And when authority weakens, disorder no longer needs to be organised. It emerges naturally. This was not a collapse announced with explosions or declarations. It was quieter, slower, a series of small failures aligning at the same moment. Families felt it first, communities sensed it next, and only later did those in power begin to grasp the scale of what had been allowed to grow. The question now facing the country was not whether the situation could be controlled tonight or tomorrow. It was whether the system still had the credibility required to restore order at all. Because history shows that collapse rarely arrives loudly. More often, it arrives after long periods of denial. And by the time it is acknowledged, the damage is already done. By the second night, the atmosphere had changed. What began as confusion had hardened into something colder and more deliberate. According to internal assessments, authorities were no longer dealing with scattered incidents, but with a public mood that had crossed a psychological threshold. Streets were calmer on the surface, yet more tense underneath. Shops that reopened did so briefly, watching doors more than customers. Public transport moved, but without its usual rhythm. People sensed that restraint was no longer coming from confidence, but from fear. Behind the scenes, analysts compiled what they called a convergence report. Multiple pressures, housing shortages, overstretched policing, legal gridlock, and public mistrust were no longer operating independently. They were amplifying one another. Reports suggested that once this convergence phase begins, traditional responses lose effectiveness. More patrols do not restore trust. More statements do not calm anxiety. The system starts reacting instead of leading. Emergency powers were discussed again, not publicly, but in rooms where language was careful and recorded. Sources close to those meetings claim that every option carried consequences deemed unacceptable. Enforce harder and risk legal rebellion. Enforce selectively and confirm accusations of unfairness. Do nothing and allow public confidence to drain further. The paralysis was complete, not because there were no tools left, but because using them now carried political and institutional cost. On the ground, the effects were visible. Parents began changing routines, picking children up earlier, avoiding certain routes. Small business owners hired private security they could barely afford. Frontline officers quietly admitted that morale was collapsing faster than manpower. Critics argue this is the most dangerous phase, when authority still exists on paper, but no longer commands instinctive respect. Online, discussions grew sharper. Language hardened. According to internal monitoring, people who had never engaged with political content were now sharing footage, statistics, and speculation. Yet in public spaces, silence dominated. Colleagues avoided certain topics. Neighbours nodded but did not speak. It was not agreement holding the country together, but mutual uncertainty about where the line now lay. Attention turned toward accountability. Who allowed this layering of failure? Who ignored warnings when correction was still possible? Reports suggest that several internal reviews had flagged risks years earlier, only to be deprioritised in favour of stability optics. Critics argue that the most damaging decisions were not dramatic acts, but quiet approvals, delayed audits, and softened language that reframed risk as tolerance. As trust declined, enforcement faced an impossible contradiction. Law depends on consent as much as force. Once large segments of the population believe rules are uneven, compliance becomes optional in their minds. This does not require rebellion. It requires disengagement. People stop reporting crimes, stop cooperating, stop believing outcomes will be fair. According to internal assessments, this stage is often misread as calm, when in reality it is withdrawal. Late one evening, a senior advisor reportedly summarised the situation in a single sentence. "We are governing a country that no longer believes us." That assessment never reached the public, but its implications shaped every subsequent decision. Messaging became cautious to the point of vagueness, press briefings offered reassurance without substance, and each attempt to minimise concern only reinforced the perception that reality was being filtered. History offers a pattern here. Societal breakdown is rarely a sudden collapse. It is erosion. Norms weaken, expectations lower. People adapt to instability until instability feels normal. Families focus inward. Communities fragment. And by the time leaders attempt dramatic correction, the public no longer trusts their intent. The unresolved question was no longer about immigration systems, crime figures, or enforcement policy in isolation. It was about legitimacy, whether institutions still carried moral authority, whether rules still felt shared, whether silence would hold or eventually give way to something louder. According to observers, moments like this do not announce their outcome in advance. They sit suspended, a nation holding its breath, waiting to see whether reform arrives quietly or whether pressure, long contained, finally finds release.